Countdown.
Okay, so I think it's time to get started. So hi everybody, and very many thanks for joining us today. My name's Henry Thomas, and I'm the user experience lead for Locate. So a little bit about us. At Locate, we're best known for our data validation services, which are used to capture data quickly and accurately. We work with a wide range of clients to help improve their user experience and their data quality and conversion rates and things like that. And some of our customers include ASOS, HSBC, and Oxfam. And today I'm joined by Alun Lucas, who is the MD of ZICO Analytics. And we're going to be talking a little bit of anything and everything about online forms. So we're going to cover some of the common mistakes, the best practices that we see, ways to boost conversions, and changes or updates we expect to see in the future. Forms is an interesting subject. It can be perceived to be something fairly straightforward. It's pretty easy to put form fields on a website, after all. And we've all spent countless hours entering our details into checkouts and application forms and things like that. So why wouldn't we know what to do? Well, as with plenty of the components we interact with, forms suffer from the iceberg effect, that most of the work is happening below the surface. And as the aim of a form is to convert, it's important for online retailers and other operators to give focus to how those forms perform, to understand that and to improve it. And for those in charge of improving and optimizing the form, it extends well beyond just the controls. So the drop-down menus and making the call to action bigger and brighter and trying to get conversions that way. But before we dive down into the detail and into the weeds, just a little bit of housekeeping. Questions, we will ask for questions and we'll answer those at the end. But if you've got them and you want to enter them, please drop them into the chat and we'll try and come to those towards the end of the conversation. And as we go through, for more information, we're going to share some links in the chat, and I'm going to make reference a couple of times to those links, and some of our helpful colleagues sitting in the background will hopefully drop those into the chat as we go. And a lot of those, certainly from my point of view, from the Locate side of things, are available on our resources page, which is a great place to head. And we talk around this and various other subjects in the same area quite a lot on there. So I'd highly recommend checking that out. And as I said, we're going to drop some links as we go. So Alun, to get us started, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and why ZICO are the experts in form analytics?
Okay, yeah, so thanks for that introduction, Henry. So I'm Alun Lucas. I'm the Managing Director of ZICO Analytics. And for those of you who don't know us, we are a form analytics software product. So been designed to let you know when, where, and why users are dropping out of your forms, so you have the right data to make the right decisions to improve them. And we also offer form consultancy services alongside that. In terms of why we're the experts, as if you want to put it that way, in form analysis, we are basically the only company out there that specializes in forms. Obviously, there's a lot of UX software providers out there that have a big portfolio of products, and may have a form analytics product, but we specialize only in forms. So they're obviously, we are able to develop more detailed reporting and more in-depth insight on forms, because that's all we do. And coupled with that, obviously our team only look at forms, so they're able to help you get to the answers quickly. So we know a lot about forms from our data and consultancy work. We kind of want to, we kind of position it like we're like the scalpel. We're the tool. If forms is all you're about, if forms are really important to you, use the best tool for the job versus say a Swiss Army knife, where you might want to have a broader array of functionality for your website if you're looking at heat mapping, etc. So that's kind of how we position ourselves as the specialist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always interesting to see the tools that are available there to drill into that information, and certainly from a UX point of view, the sort of the best feedback you get is when you're aiming specifically at a small area and looking at improvements of that. So that makes total sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So one area that's sort of quite close to my heart, working in user experience at Locate, what are the biggest usability mistakes you see people making in their forms? So where are the problems?
Well, so obviously, there's a lot of areas you could talk about here, but there's probably, if we break it down into two broad categories, the first one is kind of the big picture stuff, which kind of comes from the, in the design phase, the bigger philosophical piece, as it were. So there's a number of things we often see there. So the first one, which is very common, is users, so businesses build forms from their perspective rather from the user perspective. And again, that's probably a historic thing. You used to just write out a form, send it out. People would have to fill it in and post it back to you. People kind of take that attitude. What data do we need? We're just going to put it out there, and the user will just have to give it to us. So you're asking for a lot of things. Marketing department might be asking for, give me 10 different demographic things that we want to do, so we can segment them and put them in our CRM system and email them. And or your legal team might be like, okay, they need to agree to this or whatever. And rather than building it from a user perspective, what do they want to get out of the form at this stage? So often you'll see people throw everything into the first stage of a form or the first iteration of a form, which is suboptimal for the user. Whereas it might be better if you just said, okay, at this stage, we're going to ask for basic information. We'll then follow up. And once we know what the user wants, we can then ask the relevant questions. So I think from a broad perspective, actually look at it from the point of view of the user rather than the company. Second big one we see is around mobile optimization. It's a big one because, again, often form designers design the form on desktop and they put it on mobiles and afterthought. They put it on there. And so what you'll see is a lot of UX issues where the translation doesn't work. Whether that's just, the very worst ones are you've got an HTML page of desktop concentrated in a very small mobile screen. And I had some of those last summer when I was trying to fill out COVID forms to go to Italy or what have you. So literally you're trying to zoom in and click, and then they still have things like drop downs with like 20 options that you're trying to pass through and click and all that sort of stuff. I mean, and this is an extreme, but you see on a smaller level, actually what's the most optimal mechanic to get people to answer questions and all that sort of stuff. So as a general piece, mobile optimization is a big issue. Next thing we often see is a kind of a lack of knowledge about what's going on in the form. There's a black box approach. So maybe from Google Analytics how many people reach the form, and from your own system how many people drop out the bottom successfully. You don't really know what's going on in between. You don't know where they're dropping off, where they're struggling, what's annoying them. So if you don't even know that, then how can you make the right decisions to improve the form? So that's it's not so much a usability mistake, but it's a mistake that people make, which leads to poor usability. And then the kind of final point on that piece is expectation management. I don't know if you've been to fill out a form. It can happen, say travel, for example, or whatever it may be. You go through, you think you go filling out the form, you come to section 5 and they say, I can get your passport or your social security number or whatever. And you're like, oh, what is that? It's my passport number. And you have to go away, go upstairs, root through the box wherever you threw your passport 6 months ago, try and find it, come back. And by the time you've got back, you've been timed out. So there's a lot of poorer usability experiences because of that, because people don't manage expectations up front about what they need. Also, like, how long is it going to take? Because sometimes you think, oh, it's going to take me a couple of minutes to fill this form out. And you're still there 10 minutes later. Like, I didn't really plan for this. So again, it's the expectation management that you see that often impacts the user experience. If you tell them what to expect, at least they can allocate the time and get the resources so they've got the smooth experience when they do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a UX point of view, when we're looking at things at Locate, we like to start talking in terms of jobs to be done. So establish what's the job to be done for the user right here. What do they want to achieve? And then everything really leads on from that, so that you know that you're not sort of just orientating it towards your internal business practice or something like that, and you're making sure that you set them up and you empathize with them in that case.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm just sort of just building on that, because obviously that was the big picture stuff. You then got the sort of layer of smaller stuff, say individual issues. So that's where you have frustration with the form itself. So if you have, we often see like bad validation. So you put in a phone number and you put spaces in there, and it comes back and says, oh, invalid phone number. No, that's my phone number. So you have those sort of issues, and then kind of the final thing that we often see issues with are questions that people don't want to answer. Why are you asking me that question? Insurance is often one that you see, because people want to go to an insurance company, they want a quote. They don't want to give you personal details up front and say, okay, here's all my details, and then I get the quote. They say, just tell me how much it's going to cost, then I'll decide. So often those are the things you kind of want to look at when you're thinking about usability.
Yeah, I guess there's that always that tight balance between the questions you'd like to ask and the questions you need to ask, and that's always the
exactly. I mean, that's often a political thing within the organisation, but you can guarantee the user will notice it, and there will be users who will drop out.
Sure. So I guess without naming names exactly, are you able to give us some examples of good forms, bad forms practice that you've seen recently?
In terms of recent stuff, one form stands out quite recently, which was quite an interesting one. It was a US-based bank which had a mortgage form, and what they had done was, it looked like at least they just translated their paper mortgage form onto a single page of their website. So you'd click through and there would be like hundreds of questions on one big long scrolling page on anything and everything, whether it's relevant or not relevant to the user they had to put in there. So there was, it wasn't broken down into steps, which we know improves performance. There was no conditionality. So you went through and you saw every question, rather than ruling people, putting questions which were relevant. It was just an absolutely horrible user experience. And that's, again, to be fair, you don't see that too much nowadays. And this is probably a semi-regional US bank, so maybe a little bit less sophisticated, but still there's no real excuse for it. It's kind of just, it's lazy, and that was the most horrendous form experience I've seen recently. And that's just in terms of design. I mean, I didn't go through it and answer all the questions to see if the execution was any good, but because I was put off straight away before testing it. So that's in terms of bad one. I mean, in terms of good ones, it's a tricky one, because we see a lot of forms which seem good, and they are good. So they've got to a level where you've eliminated all the obvious issues. There's nothing there you're going, oh, that's horrible for the user. And most people will be able to work their way through it, even if they have a little niggle here and there. But what you kind of see is they're good but not perfect. So they may be let down by a few validation fields, or just a few error messages or instructional copy. And so it's kind of more of a question. Then it becomes, okay, how do we incrementally improve? And that's where it's more, if you've got an experimentation program, if you've identified, say, a couple of fields that have a worse abandonment rate than you'd expect, is okay, how can we improve that? Let's change the copy, let's change the validation, let's perhaps even remove the field, do we need it? And therefore it builds through experimentation, either through an A/B test or however you want to do it, to say, okay, that improves, and it kind of becomes a test and refine. And that's often what we see. The cadence is go in, have a look, see if there's any horrible issues you just need to fix those. You've then probably in a place where your form is decent, and then you can then say, okay, let's optimize and do that over the next 6 months to a year to take it to the next level by adding a percent here, a couple of percent here, that all adds up.
Sure. I guess with anything, and this, I guess, a main tenet of UX design, that measurement and iteration is the key, right? And yeah. I think it ties back to something you mentioned earlier, which is you can only start to review and have that if you can properly understand what's happening in the form. So that's for me, is always the first stage, is establish what's happening, understand what your users are doing, and then iterate and improve that. So at Locate, one of our our key products is type ahead address capture, right?
Mm.
So from your point of view, what impact does autofill and type ahead address capture have on conversion rates?
Okay, well, I mean, obviously, you guys probably got more data specifically on the type ahead address capture. I would hope so, anyway. But you know, I don't have. We are working actually at the moment on autofill using our data to get some accurate data from ourselves. But I've you know looked at third-party studies. I do know there's a Google study on autofill, and by autofill, to be specific, that means browser autofill. So it's the one where you type in and your name comes up and you select. So do you know that can speed up the form fill by 30%? And there's various studies out there that can show it. The best one I saw was, well, so the biggest upside one was a trebling of conversion rate for lead capture forms, which is obviously a relatively simple thing to passing through. So we know it can work, and obviously Google have tested it, and it does lead to a slightly smoother user experience as long as you've built the form in the right way, so the right fields get dropped, pulled through, because no one wants to have like their surname in their first name field or whatever, that sort of thing. That'll ruin it. But if you do it correct, you can speed people through. And we do see, like, at least on the majority of forms, people do use that for the base information that gets dropped in. You'll see when we look at data, we can basically tell it's autofill if it's just one interaction with a field. So no one's typed 5 things; it's just one change, and you can see that is used in the majority of cases, certainly for desktop execution. So we know it's a positive for user experience. But I don't know if you've got anything to build on that, given your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's any surprise to people that someone from Locate's got stuff to talk about on that subject. But it's, I guess, the improvement on user experience and conversion is certainly the message that we get from our customers, right? And our type ahead address lookup complements that browser-based autofill, right? So it adds in there, making sure that people like e-commerce vendors and things like that have accurate addresses they know they can ship to, delivery points, that kind of thing. Yeah. I'll ask my colleagues again if we can drop some links to case studies into the chat. You can find them on the resources page that I mentioned before. But we've got customers that report significant, and by significant, we're talking sort of double-digit improvements in conversion rates. And I think it's that coupling, right? So when you couple that with other form best practices, so when you're improving your form and then having these autocomplete type ahead things in there, you'd start to see significant improvements in form performance, particularly where speed and ease and accuracy are important. So you've got things like e-commerce checkouts, and you want to reduce the overhead of the address input and that kind of thing, particularly for mobile input, where multiple forms are not always the easiest thing to flow through in that environment. Then that helps. And things like reverse geolocation in that case, where you can start to just pick up accurate addresses from your location and things like that. So mobile devices are particularly good for that, where you've got a very accurate mobile location data coming in. So yeah, if we can share those links, guys, that would be great. So we start to get down into the detail and the weeds of this kind of thing. What would you say your top 3 considerations when designing forms?
Yeah, so if I was sitting down designing a form from scratch, there's probably 3 principles that I'd want to establish or look at while we were doing it. The first one, which we've talked about a reasonable amount, is what information do you actually need, as opposed to what information do you want. So what do you need? What's the objective of the form for both the user and for the business? And what's the information that you need to achieve that? If you're just looking to capture a lead, do you just need the email address? As an example. Or do you need to go deeper? If you've got a mortgage, okay, well, what's the specific stuff you need to do? If it's an in-principle decision, can you have a quick check function, which gives you a quick check, and someone says, are you eligible for this loan, insurance, whatever it may be? They get a quick answer, and then they can go on to more detailed answers, so you're not wasting people's time. So that's the audit you need to do of exactly what you need So that's stage one. Then stage two or second principle is kind of what's the right format to ask for each piece of information. Now, sometimes this may be obvious, like name is likely to be a text box. But, some of the other stuff, you might have to think about, okay, what do we need to do? Say date of birth, what's the right things? I mean, we're very strong advocates of 3 text boxes for date of birth, but, some people use drop downs or whatever it may be, which we would argue against. But those are the sort of considerations you need to look at. Okay, why do you need it? What would you use? Would you use radio buttons, drop downs, all those sort of sliders, those sort of things?
It's an interesting thing on that one as well, where at the moment you've got these 2 mechanisms. So desktop, where you've got a keyboard that isn't going to change, and then you've got mobile, where you've got an adaptive keyboard to what you're putting in. And those 2 experiences, I guess, can be quite different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely. So you've got to make sure you're thinking about that. And there's lots. I mean, we have, lots of blogs on our website about that sort of stuff. What you should use. I say we're not big fans of drop downs, but sometimes they're a necessary evil, and sometimes they're all right. I guess with address autofill, which filters, it gives you the, you can potentially use it for that. But if you've got a list of countries, 200 countries, it's just a nightmare. But so you need to think, okay, do I use that? Do I use a search bar in it? All those sort of things. And hand in hand in that is, okay, what's my validation? What am I going to validate? So if I'm using a text box, how do I validate the user's entry? So phone number being the classic example. Do we have particular rules that well, ideally you would create rules that are user-based rules, so minimize the validation rules. So let them put in a phone number that they're comfortable with, whether they put spaces, dashes, whatever. That would be the best way. So look at that and making sure you're making active decisions on the format and the validation. It's kind of the second principle. And then the final bit is, okay, how do we communicate the request? So arm in arm with the managing of expectations that we talked about before, if that was necessary, okay, for each individual field, what's your instructional microcopy going to be? Is it clear to the user that's what it is? Are you explaining any jargon terms? If you're asking about gross income and things like that, do you need to add any explanatory stuff so it's absolutely clear for them, both in the microcopy and also in the error messages? So rather than just saying, "Oh, computer says no, your message is invalid," you're entering, it's like, okay, why? What do I need to do to correct this? And so you've got to always be thinking about, again, one base principle is think about it from the user point of view and test it if you can, or at least use some patterns. That the UK Gov patterns are great. They've been tested a lot, so you can do that. So you basically got to be thinking about these things, and I suppose that in a way is the principle. Make sure you're thinking about it, not just importing from a spreadsheet or whatever it may be, because it's easy to build. Like you said at the start, forms are easy to build if you need to just dump it in and let the user work it out. Actually, no, think about it from their point of view. So those are the 3 considerations. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And I think that it comes down to that empathy question again, right? Which is, trying to put yourself into the user's shoes, ask what information you'd be willing to share for this thing, and try to get outside. I think so often we get into the bubble of our own business or our own information, and it makes total sense to us why we'd want to gather that. And I think often, again, when we're talking about the information that we do gather, it's generally always for good intentions. We never think, okay, we're going to gather up a load of data here in order to spam this person or something like that. But it's about how that's interpreted, I guess, when that comes through, to say, okay, why does this person want this information? Why do they want to gather it? And then that's, before you dive into the whole, required information under GDPR and that kind of thing, before you get into okay, so to wrap up and to bring that to where we're going now, what are the sort of future trends either that you see emerging or that you think are likely to emerge for form design going forward?
Interesting one. Actually, this is one I think in the comments it'd be quite an interesting one to if anyone's got any ideas. So the future trends, I think some things, I think we're moving a lot towards a single click, not so much autofill, but single click entry, where whatever mechanism that may be. So it may be Obviously, someone like Amazon kind of does it because they store all your details in their ecosystem, so you don't need to keep repeating it. But are there mechanisms whereby you, in a GDPR context, you keep control of your data and are able to input it? So at the moment, the simple ways of doing it is browser autofill. It's social sign-in as well, where you sign in with Facebook or whatever, and kind of retain the information and pass it on and retain control about what you're giving. But is there a broader company out there that's going to come in and almost create this ownership of data yourself? Because obviously with Facebook, you're never quite sure. You still don't trust, that they've got your data, they can do what they want with it. But if you own it yourself, you have this piece of, I'm going to give it to this form, and it's going to be clear, and there's going to be GDPR limits, and I'm going to be able to check who I've given my data to, and then I'm going to be able to request from within that to be deleted at some future level, because obviously I think that's kind of what we'll see, and we're kind of seeing it to a degree, but I think, some sort of user owning their own data.
Yeah, I think that self-sovereignty question in this and many other areas as well is something that's really interesting. I think we're starting to see the first forays into that of good technology that empowers the user to do that. That's starting to come to that. But it'll be really interesting to see where that goes over the next 5 years, particularly in the sort of allowance and the revocation side of that data as well, and how we handle that kind of thing. I think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah. And then the other things are, again, probably things we're going to see is it's more multi-steps. We see it with companies like Typeform, who basically split out each question into a single answer. Now, which can work very well, obviously, if you're doing a mortgage form, it's probably not great because you've got 100 questions and you're getting asked there. But I think we'll see more of that because generally the studies show that improves user experience, improves conversion, and reduces the cognitive load on the user. So you will see that better. I mean, all of these are kind of utopian. I'm seeing we're going towards a promised land of better forms. Let's hope we're not regressing. But so I think we'll see that. And again, in general, we'll see that greater focus on the user. We see UX as a discipline is growing. Companies are getting more serious about it. So it is moving away from that horrible example of just translating a paper form that I talked about before. So I think we'll generally see that sort of stuff, and again, possibly leading into more responsive forms. But it kind of depends, because at the end of the day, some forms are just simple and you don't want to overcomplicate it. If you've got a lead capture form, name, email might be all you need. But some of the more complex forms, perhaps there's room for innovation there.
Yeah, I think, again, relating to something you said earlier, where if forms are your key business, there's a balance of effort there, right? So you can say, okay, we'll have this totally adaptive form that's going to work that way, but you want, I guess, the simplest solution that will satisfy that user job to be done and get you to that point. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think actually, I know we've had some comments, probably worth going over.
Sure. Yeah. So one that's come in from Abby Howell, and well, I'll read it out. The problem with browser autofill is many times it conflicts with any core site autofill that may be present. There should be either, but not both, present on the page. And I think I'll jump in on that a little bit on the locate side of things. There's something I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the lookup and that sort of a site-based type ahead thing. I think that for me on those, yes, those things can conflict when you're talking about address fields, particularly, and you're talking about the control that our product adds to that page. But I think that really it's a complementary question when it comes to the form, and it's about how you design your form field by field rather than as a whole. And so I think that actually the optimization often requires getting down to the field level. So you can say, okay, carefully dictate to the browser, and I won't go into the detail of how that's achieved, but through attributes and various other things, exactly what piece of data can go into which pit. And that way you can disable that if you've got autofill that's specific to your site, or if you've got an address type ahead or that kind of thing. And then you get the optimized view for the user, because you're absolutely right, it can be frustrating when one form has had a other information delivery field, and you type in a load of information to tell them about something, and then that keeps popping up in future forms and filling in as your name and that kind of thing. So I think there's a balance there.
Okay. That's fair enough. But I guess Abby's correct in that, yeah, like you've got to be careful about the conflict that can occur there.
I guess it's that case of iteration and testing again, as we've said before, which is try and get those use cases and work through them. So more comments. So from a user, drop downs can be horrible, especially on mobile. Yeah, I think we agree. I don't know if you wanted to add to what you've already said on.
Not really. No, so we've got a whole blog on a website about that. You just really, sometimes you have to use them, but it's, always look for alternatives where possible.
Sure. And then another comment coming in. I need to understand more on what you said about autofill regarding conversion. Is it a good practice or not? I don't know whether you want to start on that.
I think generally, yes, it's good practice. You should do it. So you'll speed up the user's progression through the form. Obviously, you can't do it on every field, but it's those fields that people have got to put in. With the caveats that we talked about before about, any core site autofill. And also, actually, you've got to be careful on your validation, because one of the biggest frustrations you can see is phone number fields. So if one site, they put in +44 or plus whatever, and then number in, and the site's accepted it, they then autofill into your site, and your site does not accept that format. That's going to be a problem. They're just going to get annoyed. But having said that, assuming you get over those wrinkles, in principle, yes, it's a better user experience if they're happy to have their browser save their details.
Yeah, absolutely, and I totally agree on that. I think it's generally a better user experience. It's going to let people get through those forms quicker and often fill in most of those fields. I think to cover what I said about it relating to the type ahead address lookup, it's again about that job to be done question, which part of e-commerce, for example, is the user wants that parcel that they've ordered, the thing they've ordered, to get to them. So the part of that job to be done is about entering an accurate delivery point address and things like that that the vendor can ultimately ship to. And so that's where things like the type ahead and stuff like that come in to make sure that good data is being captured every time.
Yeah.
So another, and I think maybe the last of our comments come in from another LinkedIn user. Still surprised how many people haven't checked whether their forms work on mobile at all. Often on mobile, and find forms completely unusable, even with well-known companies. Yeah, so from a UX point of view, I think that the transition to mobile or responsive, or however you want to approach these sites, hasn't always gone well. And Alan, you mentioned before, the direct transfer of that from, for example, a physical form into the digital is not always the best way to do that. And I guess that's where companies like yours come in to try and improve that experience, right?
No, absolutely, yeah, it is. I think you see that, and I don't know why it is, whether it's just laziness. Sometimes, often they believe they've designed the form for mobile because they just put it in a column, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got the ideal format for mobile and or anything like that. So yeah, it's I don't know why it is. I mean, often kind of chicken and egg, because people probably see that most of their form completions might come from desktop, and which is the case often with financial forms, because maybe people do have a slight preference for desktop if they can do it. But then there's a entire segment of customers who would prefer to do it on mobile. But because companies see everyone's using desktop anyway, they don't do anything on the mobile and kind of perpetuate the problem. It's like, okay, well, we'll just focus on optimizing our desktop form, and the mobile is left to languish and don't make any changes there. So yes, I'm not surprised that this user has found a lot of bad mobile forms.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I think we've got towards the end of our comments and things like that. Just leaves me to say thank you, Alan, for joining us. It's been a really interesting conversation. And thanks to everyone else for joining, for leaving your comments and things like that. And hopefully we'll speak to some of you very soon. And thanks very much.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.